So that's John chapter 5, verses 1 to 15. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem, near the Sheep Gate, a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me in the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes in down ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. The day on which this took place was a Sabbath, and so the Jewish leaders said to the man who had been healed, "It is a Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" So they asked him, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk?" The man was healed and no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you're well again. Stop sinning or something worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had made him well.
Thanks, Gebs. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Andy. If you're here for the first time, I'll just echo Dave and say we love that you're here. Welcome, welcome to P's and G's. The series that we're in at the moment is we're looking at John's Gospel, and I am going to launch straight in because what I'm finding every single week is that there's so much in the passage. It is impossible really to cover it all, but I want to try and cover as much ground as we can. And there's an article that I read on the BBC a couple of weeks ago that has kind of just been hitting around the inside of my skull ever since I read it. And it's some of you would have seen it. It talks about drug deaths in Scotland. And it says that we are the drug death capital of Europe. And that although drug deaths have declined in the last little while, we are nevertheless still number one. And there is a sense from what they've said that drug deaths next year are going to be going higher and higher. And part of the article is really asking this question of how is it that we've ended up where we are? And obviously the answer to that is it's complicated, but it suggests that a crisis that arose really kind of in the second half of the 20th century where manufacturing across Scotland shut down and the steel mills went silent and the shipyards were closed, and it really left behind a generation of particularly men who struggled to adapt to that. And in 1972, there was a trade unionist called Jimmy Reid who gave a speech at the University of Glasgow that became quite famous. And in it, he says that Britain's major social problem could be summed up in one word, and the word is alienation. Another way of putting that might be to talk about isolation. Another way might be to talk about loneliness. And he said that people viewed themselves in many ways as victims of forces that were outside of their control. They were being swept along by these forces with no real ability or agency in their own lives. And to quote him, he said that reality for them led to, and I quote, and it should come up on the screen, a feeling of despair and hopelessness that pervades people who feel with justification that they have no real say in shaping or determining their own destinies. And so unpacking that, what the article was saying is that in many ways the turn to narcotics or to alcohol or to other substance abuse, and ultimately for some the turn towards suicide, really was an attempt to escape a reality that they could find no other way out of. They had this feeling of despair, and they needed a fire exit to it. And so they went for the closest thing that they could find, or the most effective thing that they could find. And those type of deaths have collectively been called, and this is the phrase that stayed with me, deaths of despair. Deaths of despair. And the message of Jesus, if I could sum up in a little phrase, would be, he arrives to declare not that there are deaths of despair, but the death of despair. When we understand who he is and we see him for who he reveals himself to be, we understand really we're leaning into the end of despair. Now, to talk about suicide and drug addiction in this kind of way can feel quite extreme. Some of us, many of us might think, well, how am I going to relate to that? And it's good if that feels a long way away from our story. At the same time, for lots of us, we will likely find ourselves at different points grappling with feelings of overwhelm, feelings of despair, wrestling with a sense of hopelessness, feeling like we are in some way victims of forces that are outside of our control, that are taking us in a direction that we never wanted to go in. And for some of us, that might be the feeling of alienation, of isolation, this sort of sense that nobody really knows me. That when I'm out and about and I'm in the pub with people, I'm at work with people, I'm interacting fine, but then I go home and I shut the door and it's just me, and it just doesn't feel like that is enough. To quote Tom, those feelings of kind of lacking in self-worth, the self-hatred that he talked about experiencing towards himself. For others of us, we're in relationships, and the relationships maybe aren't going very well. They're breaking down, or they have broken down, and perhaps we were never heading for the altar, but it felt like we were, and suddenly it feels like we've been abandoned or left at the altar. For others of us, it may feel like we're in a marriage that is fracturing and cracking. And then for many of us, the story that we have is not the story that we wanted. It's perhaps not the story that we imagined, and we find ourselves overwhelmed by anxiety. And it's again, not many people would know because we're quite private about it, but it's there and we know. Or we find ourselves battling with some other condition, or we just have got a lot of regret. And it just feels like we've got this aftertaste in our mouth of things we wish we'd done or things we thought we were going to do that it turns out we've ended up not doing. So we will, all of us, find ourselves from time to time with feelings of despair and feelings of hopelessness. And perhaps we won't turn necessarily to something like drugs to solve the problem, but we find our own fire exits, our own ways of escaping reality. And so we'll turn to things that help us escape, whether that's workaholism or whether that's play. It's usually work or play, one of the two, sometimes both. But we distract ourselves away from our despair. So this is us in the 21st century on a bad week. Let's go back to Jesus in the first century in Jerusalem. And there is a festival, which means Jerusalem is full of people. And Jesus, we find him walking among a crowd of people in John chapter 5 at a pool called Bethesda. And the pool was a natural spring. So for one reason or another, every now and then, the waters of this spring would become disturbed. And it had become renowned as a place where people got healed. So a colonnade, which is kind of a covered walkway, had been built around this pool. And when Jesus is there, it is crammed with people. And we're told in the passage, you would have seen it, that it's crammed with people who are sick, who are ill, who are blind, who are paralyzed. And every now and then, whenever the water bubbled up, everybody, you can kind of imagine the rush and the sense of panic, because the urban myth was that the first person into the pool would be healed. So the moment the water bubbled, everybody around it, and we are talking hundreds of very, very ill people, would rush to try and be the first one into the water. The sense of desperation in the air would have been tangible. And one individual that we're told about in the crowd of hundreds, we're told has been there for 38 years. Now, I don't know how often the water bubbled up, but you can imagine if he's been there for 38 years, that's a lot of failed attempts to get in first. That's a lot of times where maybe he's thought, maybe this time could be my time and it doesn't work out for him. Well, maybe it'll be next time. Maybe the next time. After 38 years of maybe the next time, you would have thought that the hope would have been completely drained from his system. You imagine this person to be someone who's kind of caught up in despair. And he has a conversation with Jesus in which he says, "Sir," the invalid replied, this is John 5:7, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred." So not only has he been there for 38 years, but he's been there alone. Now consider this. We know there's a big crowd there. He's in a crowd of people. He's in a crowd of hundreds of people crammed into that space. And yet he says this, "I am alone. I have no one to help me." And it's possible, and we know it is, to be surrounded by hundreds of people and yet be alone. It's ironic that we are, in many ways, the most connected society that has ever existed, and yet lots of surveys would tell us the most isolated and the most alone. So he's surrounded. He's a man who can't walk. He's a man who cannot help himself because 38 years of trying has not proven anything, and he's a man with no one else to help him. He's totally alone, trapped in despair. If you can picture him, I imagine him to be somebody who is lost at sea, literally shipwrecked in the darkness, trying and fighting to keep his head above water, but swallowing it every now and then. And you're looking at this person and you're thinking, I don't know if they're going to last very much longer. And then he meets Jesus. And in John's gospel, Jesus does what are called signs, miracles. And there are 7 of them that are recorded by John. I'm not going to go through all of them, but there's a little slide that will show you, if you're interested, what the 7 signs are. We're on sign number 3. And the word sign is not used in this particular passage, but it's interesting that John uses the word sign to describe a miracle. Because what a sign is it's something that points beyond itself to a reality that's further ahead. So if we were to go on a road and we see a sign to Glasgow, we see a sign to Aberdeen, we know that that is pointing us to something that is over there. In the same way with the miracles of Jesus, what they are, these signs, is they point beyond simply what is happening in the moment to a reality. And this particular sign, the question for us is, what is it pointing out to us about Jesus? What is it that this sign would remind us of about him, that it's so easy in all the busyness and all the hecticness and all the have I forgotten this and have I remembered that and what do I need to do this week? In all of that, it's so easy to forget certain things about Jesus. And for anybody who is here for the first time, you've never been through the doors of a church until this morning, what would this sign tell us about who Jesus is? What can we discover as he interacts with this person that speaks to us today in our times of despair, in our feelings of hopelessness? Here's the first thing. Number 1, Jesus sees us. So in the passage, it does not say, when the man saw Jesus. It says, when Jesus saw him lying there. And there are other miracle stories, quite a few of them, where people go looking for Jesus. They go pursuing him. There are all sorts of stories of people pushing through crowds to get to Jesus. But this is a story of Jesus moving through a crowd to get to somebody who doesn't even know he's there. And we can imagine how it must have felt for this man when he's alone in this crowd, feeling like nobody ever saw him. You know, the water gets stirred, everybody barges past him. Everybody rushes past him. He looks around, he sees other people who are being carried, other people who are being helped by their friends and family, and he's got nobody. So what that leads to is a feeling that, you know, am I even here? Does anybody even care? And yet Jesus comes, and Jesus sees. One of the stories this reminds me of is something that happened at our church back in Watford, where I used to live. And I remember there was a particular Sunday morning when I was just saying hi to a few people before our service began. And I saw this guy who I'd had a couple of interactions with. This is just after lockdowns finished and COVID was kind of coming to an end. I'd had a few interactions with him on and off over a year or so, but I didn't know him very well. And I said, oh, hey, I haven't seen you for ages. Good to see you. And I said, how are you? And he said, not good. And his story had been that he wasn't a follower of Jesus. He had lost his job just before COVID. And then COVID had been horrendous for him. And in his despair, he had called out to God. And he'd had some answers to prayers that he was surprised by. So he decided he was going to try church out. So he came along and came a few times and then dropped off the radar. And then came back this one particular Sunday morning. And I said, "How are you?" He said, "Not good." He said, "Actually, I've come here looking for a sign from God." That was his language. "I need a sign from God." And he said, "Last time I came looking for a sign from God and I got one. And so this time I'm back. And you need to know," what he told me was, "you need to know that if I don't get a sign from God this morning, I'm going to kill myself." And I had to start the service in about, a couple of minutes. So I said to him, "Look, stay here. Do not go anywhere. We will talk afterwards. I will find somebody to chat with you if I can't do it. Stay there." And I went up to the front and I had to get up and just introduce the service, say we're going to worship God together. So we go into the song worship time, and then there's a reading, and then there's a talk. Halfway through the talk, a member of our congregation who's a primary school teacher called Becca texted me. And I checked my phone, and it just was a message from Becca that said, "I've just been praying and trying to hear God, and I felt like God said to me that there's somebody here who's thinking about committing suicide. And they need to know that God sees them and that we see them." The moment I got that text, I wanted to jump out of my seat, run to this guy and say, "There's your flipping sign," right? It doesn't get better than that. Let me tell you, I've been at this for a while, right? I wanted to do that, but I couldn't because the talk was going on, so I just had to leave it. And then at the end of the talk, there was an opportunity for anyone to share anything they felt God was saying, just in the congregation. So we just opened it up. Anyone who felt like they felt God say something, they could share it. And this, as it happened, Becca, I didn't need to share it because she shared it loudly with the whole room. And so after that, when people were praying for each other, I got Becca and her husband over, and they prayed for this guy. And Becca later explained to me that she had listened to the reading. She thought the Lord had said that. And then she'd heard the reading, which happened to be about Acts 16, where they all escaped from the jail. I'd never read this as a passage about suicide before. But the jailer is going to kill himself until Paul calls out, "Hey, don't do that. We're all still here." And she had really felt God spoke to her through it. So they pray for this guy. This guy ends up going home with a couple of people from the church. In the long term, he ends up living with them, and his life is totally transformed. He hasn't yet given his life to Jesus, interestingly enough, but he's on a major journey. And what I love when I look back at that is just this truth, which is that God saw him. Jesus sees us. Isn't it interesting that it says Jesus learned he had been lying there for 38 years? That's a strange number. Why not 40? Why not Jesus saw him and heard that he'd been lying there about 40 years? Or why not Jesus saw him and learned that he'd been lying there for ages? Why 38? I think the reason for that is because he'd been lying there for 38 years. Exactly. I think the reason is because when we say he sees us, what we mean by that is we mean he sees the detail of our lives. We're not just a general person, not just another one to him, but he understands everything that is going on inside our hearts and inside our lives. And he sees those things that we can control and affect, and he sees those things that we can't. He sees our tears, he sees our fears, he sees our hopes. Students are obviously, you're coming back, it's great to have you here. And I remember when I was a student, I got dropped off for the first time at university. And one of my main memories of being dropped at university was arriving at my college, and the guy who was on the door showing you where your room was like really not very friendly. And then I got my stuff, and I only had a sports, but I didn't have very much stuff with me actually. I took my stuff up to my room, and I sat on my bed, and I shut the door, and I sat there and I actually cried for quite a while. And I think I was just scared. The emotion of it got the better of me in that particular moment. And I found it really hard being in a space where nobody knew me. I find it hard to have left my family and left my community and left my friends and kind of be branching out on my own for the first time ever. I can still remember vividly that there was a bar just opposite where lots of the students would go, and I would have to count to 10 to make myself go into the bar because I was shy and I didn't want to do it. And yet I look back at that moment now, and it might have been that I was sitting with the door closed so nobody could see, but somebody saw me. There was one person who saw me. If that's for me, I'm not in. And listen to this verse from Jesus, right? So it says in Luke chapter 12, verse 6, this is him trying to reassure us. And he says this, are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? 5 of these things are just sold for 2 pennies, right? And then he goes on to say, yet not one of them is forgotten by God. Indeed, the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Now, for some of you, it takes him longer to count than for others. But the very hairs of your head are numbered. Therefore, don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. And that's his way of saying, I see you. So for some of us, that might make us feel this idea that God sees us perhaps a little bit uncomfortable, because for me, it can be like, oh my goodness, so he sees everything. So he sees all that I do. I might start to feel a little bit nervous about that. And it's not that he approves of everything that we do, and there are some things absolutely we need to leave behind. But any sense where it communicates God seeing us in the scripture is it's a look of love. It's like he's not waiting to catch us out. He's waiting to welcome us home. So if you're here and you're feeling distant and you feel like, oh my goodness, with the Lord, he's been so far away, or I've gone so far from him. And then we hear he's looking at me. He's watching me. He sees me. He's not seeing you to condemn you. He is seeing you to welcome you in. He's like watching for us in the distance that he might run towards us. That's the kind of seeing. And the best picture I can come up with it in my own heart at the moment is, we moved from Watford to Edinburgh about a year ago, and then we had the long Scottish winter. And I would leave the house in the dark, and I would come home in the dark. And the big thing about it, and it was light for about 3 hours in the middle of the day, and the big thing about moving, for me personally as a dad, was I was just worried for my kids. Because you feel like, you know what, I can handle stuff that's happening to me, but with my children, they didn't want to leave. You know, in the eyes of my older 2 children, Watford is like the Garden of Eden, okay? And you'd feel like we'd pluck them out of paradise as we drove them up to Edinburgh. And so it was agony for us to bring them with us. And then you feel vulnerable for them because they're starting at a new school. And yes, they're young, but even so, you feel like, oh my goodness, school's like a jungle. Are they going to be okay? What are the other kids going to do to them? You go through all of that. And one of my memories of last winter was we'd have breakfast as a family, and then I would leave before they, while they were still sort of eating away at their breakfast, I would go out the back door into the garage where I kept my bike and I'd cycle into church. But just before I would go through the garage door, I'd just turn around in the darkness and I'd see the back of our house. And because it was dark outside, the lights were on inside, and I would look at my children. There's a lot of them, 4 boys. I would look at them through the window, and just for a bit, I just watched them. If there was any particularly difficult parenting moments that I could see through the window, that's when I got on my bike and left. But I'd watch them through the window. And then I would cycle home at night, right? And I'd usually try and get home for dinner time. So I cycle home, park my bike, take my helmet off, and I'd go out the back door, and I'd just stand there and I'd see them again. And I would just watch them. And I could have stood there for a while. Sometimes I did. And the look I gave was, honestly, I can't believe they're mine. It was love. It was, in my case, fear for them as well. I hope this happens. I hope this goes okay. I hope they'll be all right. I looked at them. Do you know that Jesus sees you? Even when you're not looking at him, he watches you. And it's with total love. So, that's the first thing. Here's the second. Jesus comes to us. He comes to us. And you've got a man here who can't even get to the pool. He's never going to get to Jesus. Even if he knew who Jesus was, which he doesn't. Even if he knew that, he couldn't ever make it to Jesus. He doesn't have any friends who can carry him to Jesus, as happens with another paralytic. So he's got no way of getting there. But what happens is, it's okay, because Jesus comes to him. And he asks him this question, do you want to get well? And that right there is a picture of Christianity. The heart of Christianity captured in a little interaction between Jesus and this guy. This guy can't get to his healing. So his healing comes to him. The message of Jesus is, sometimes it's hard to process it because it seems painful and difficult at the start. It's this: you can't save yourself. You can try for 38 years, you can try for longer, and you won't manage it. But it's okay, because salvation comes to you. He comes to us. And know that when he comes, he doesn't come to condemn. People keep their distance from God sometimes because they think he's out to criticize. Now, don't get me wrong, he tells us how to live and he tells us how not to live. But when Jesus comes, he doesn't come to condemn, nor does he come, interestingly enough, to tell the guy to try harder. You know what? If you just got up earlier, if you just moved a little bit quicker, if you're a bit more strategic about how you were doing things, then you'd be able to heal yourself. Doesn't tell him to try harder. He just comes with a question. Do you want to be well? And when we're trapped in despair, despair says no one is coming to help you. Despair says there really isn't any way out of this apart from these ways, which are ultimately destructive and just lead to more despair. That's where it guides us. But Jesus comes into that space and he poses a different question, which is this: do you want to be well? And let's just take a moment in that to reflect on the gentleness of Jesus, because he is all-powerful. And we heard a few weeks ago, he made the entire universe. I mean, that is pretty impressive to have that on your CV. He holds the stars in the heavens. He makes the planet go around the sun. He holds all of it. And so really, in many ways, he can do whatever he wants. Yet he would come to us, one so powerful, and not impose himself upon us as people with power so often do. He doesn't impose himself on anyone. He gives us choice. For those of us who feel like we're victims of forces outside of our control, victims of others who have done things to us that they should never have done, Jesus doesn't come in and say, I'm going to do this at you. He comes in and he says, do you want to be well? Do you want to be saved? He comes to us. Now, in this guy's instance, he comes to heal him. And maybe we need to ask him for something like that today. But for all of us, he comes to bring us to a place of wholeness. Now, finally, because we're running out of time, Jesus transforms us. Get up. This is like classic Jesus. I mean, whenever you see him walking around, I love it, because what he does is he goes to people who cannot do the thing and he tells them to do the thing. So he goes to like blind people and just says, see at them, right? Which in anybody else's books would be, torturing them, essentially. But for Jesus, it's like it's bringing healing to them. He goes to a storm and tells it to be quiet, and the storm is quiet. He basically finds a little picnic and he tells it to multiply, and it multiplies. He goes to people who are covered in leprosy, skin conditions that make them unclean. He tells them to be clean, and they become clean. He goes to this guy who has not got up in 38 long, agonizing years, and he tells him, get up. Not only that, he goes a step further. Pick up your mat. This guy hasn't picked up his mat in 38 years. And walk. He hasn't walked anywhere in 38 years. Jesus. A little later, when we come to another sign, he'll speak to a dead guy and tell him to come out of his grave. It's just such a Jesus thing to do. And Jesus, he loves it, right? And he can do that because there really are no limitations for Jesus. There's no boundaries for Jesus. He can do what the spring is trying to do. This little pool of water is doing incredibly ineffectually. He just comes and does it in a single moment. And the reality is this: Jesus can transform whatever it is you happen to be going through. And I know it feels like no one else can, and maybe no one else wants to help, but he does. It's why he came. You are not alone. And because I'm running out of time, here's where I'll finish. There is, in The Lord of the Rings, one of my favorite books, this particular scene where, if you've never read The Lord of the Rings, there's a city which is kind of like the last hope of the human race, as it were, a city called Gondor that is under siege by this evil giant army. And the lord of the city is this guy called Denethor, who is in many ways a champion among men. He's wise, he's lordly, he's powerful, he's ancient of days, he's impressive. But when it comes to the crunch, Denethor crumbles. And the reason he crumbles, it becomes apparent later on, is because he has seen the reality. He's seen the fact that his men are well outmatched. He's seen the fact that the invading army is huge. And as a result of that, he has despaired. He has looked at it and he has despaired. So he cannot handle it and he falls from greatness. And then in contrast, there's a conversation that happens at another point where Gandalf, the wise wizard, says despair is only for those who can see all ends. Even the very wise, he says, cannot see all ends. If you find yourself in a situation where you think, I need to despair now, my question would be, can you see the very end yet? And as the siege goes on, it gets blacker and blacker and darker, and it looks like it really is the end. It really is going to go wrong. And then reinforcements arrive. And this giant army from a nearby land, a giant army, literally cavalry, arrive. A giant army of cavalry arrive. And there's this scene in the film where they all crest the hill as the sun comes up and they put their horns to their lips. And it says in the book, all the horns in the host were lifted up in music, and the blowing of the horns of Rohan in that hour was like storm upon the plain and a thunder in the mountains. And this little hobbit, Pippin, is kind of like absolutely terrified as it's like, oh my goodness, this is the end, when he hears the horns. And suddenly it says as though a great burden lifted off his shoulders. And in the years that go by ever since, Pippin cannot hear a horn without tears coming into his eyes because it reminds him of that moment. Despair on the one hand, hope on the other. Can you hear it? Can you hear the horn? Can you hear the trumpet sound? If you can't hear it now, one day you will. Because Paul writes, and make no mistake, this is a picture of resurrection. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 that one day, in the twinkling of an eye, we will all be transformed. That one day we will hear the last trumpet, and the perishable will be made imperishable, and the dead will rise from their graves. And the way that Jesus puts it in this passage, just a short time after it, is he says this. This is from the Message translation. Can we just get it up? The final little verse. Don't act so surprised. I love the understatement. Don't act so surprised. The time is coming when everyone dead and buried will hear his voice. He speaks of himself. This, Jesus, he's the death of despair. He's the birth of life. He's the birth of hope. He sees you. He comes to you. He can transform you. Dave.
Thanks, Andy. Let's invite you, if you're able, to please stand. We're going to